Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Let me start by making some introductions. Some folks you know and some folks who may be new to you. So first, the head of my Civil Rights Unit, the Wing Luke Civil Rights Unit here in the Office of the Attorney General, is Colleen Melody. She's to my immediate right. And next to Colleen, to her right and my right, is Mitchell Reese. He's also an attorney in our Civil Rights Unit and has been very involved in the case that we'll be talking about here today. Alma Paletti is an investigator in our Civil Rights Unit. She's to my far left, and to my immediate left is Jorge Barone. As many of you know, he's the executive director for the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. He'll be speaking after I give my remarks about the case, and he's been a really wonderful partner to this office on many issues, and obviously a really important voice and advocate for many thousands of Washingtonians. We're here today to tell you about a lawsuit that we filed this morning against national hotel chain Motel 6. We filed it in King County Superior Court. A bit of background is necessary before I get to the details of this case. A few months ago, you may have read that Motel 6 made national news when it was discovered that 2 Motel 6 locations in the Phoenix area regularly provided guest lists, in other words, all the guests staying at the motels, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE agents. A reporter in the Phoenix area heard that numerous individuals were being picked up by ICE at these 2 Motel 6 locations and decided to investigate. According to her report and her news article, which was picked up by national media outlets, ICE agents visited 2 corporate-owned Motel 6 locations in Arizona and asked to see guest lists. Motel 6 employees would provide the registry to them without a warrant. They provided the names of all the guests on a regular basis. ICE would then run the Latino-sounding names in a database to check immigration status. The reporter tried to speak with Motel 6's corporate office for several weeks before printing her story, but she did not get a response from Motel 6. After the news story broke, Motel 6 issued a very short statement. I'll read it to you. This was implemented at the local level without the knowledge of senior management. When we became aware of it last week, it was discontinued. Motel 6 was criticized for this short statement, which did not include an apology. The next day, they released a longer statement after they came under some criticism, this time with an apology, and again emphasizing that these actions were conducted by local actors without any direction from Motel 6 senior management. After a few days, the media moved on, and everybody assumed that these actions really were limited to these 2 Phoenix locations. We, however, decided to investigate. I think I was out of town when I read the newspaper articles that had made national news. I reached out to Colleen to say, hey, we should check and see if anything was going on in Washington State. Colleen then spoke to Mitch, and Mitch began investigating, and that led to a formal investigation of Motel 6. We have discovered that the same process that we saw in those 2 locations in the Phoenix area has been happening right here in Washington State. In other words, what happened in Arizona was most assuredly not an isolated incident. As a result, many thousands of names of Washingtonians staying at Motel 6s had their names, without their knowledge, without their consent, turned over to the federal government, to ICE. And as a result, at least 6 individuals were detained by ICE. I'll give you a little background on Motel 6 here in Washington State and then turn to the facts of our case. Motel 6 has 26 locations in our state. 11 of those locations are corporate-owned, 15 are franchises. As part of our investigation, we asked Motel 6 to provide us information on all 26 locations and whether they released guest lists to ICE agents without a warrant in Washington State. The time period of our request was from January 1st, 2015 through September 22nd, 2017. So about 2.5 years was a period of the request that we were asking for documents from Motel 6 for all 26 locations. Motel 6 has admitted, in responding to that request, that 6 corporate-owned locations in Washington State divulge confidential guest information to ICE. Specifically, Motel 6 turned over their customers, their guests' room numbers, their names, guest identification numbers, their dates of birth, their license plate numbers, and their driver's license numbers. The locations of these 6 corporate-owned motels, I believe they're on one of the charts we have here to my left. So again, these are the 6 in which Motel 6 admitted that they provided information to ICE. The locations of those 6 motels are Bellingham, Seattle, SeaTac, Tacoma, and 2 locations in Everett. I'll provide more details around one of those momentarily. 4 of those locations, Seattle, Tacoma, and the 2 Everett locations, divulged the private information of at least 9,151 guests. I want to emphasize something here, that for the 4 locations in which Motel 6 did send some information to us, even that information is incomplete. So when I say that 9,151 guests, their names were disclosed to ICE at those 4 locations during that time period, that is not complete information. We only have partial information. Motel 6 admitted that 2 additional locations, those are Bellingham and SeaTac, also voluntarily released guest information. However, Motel 6 has not yet provided any information on how many guests were affected there. So when I use that 9,000 number, that's for the 4 that we have numbers for. The other 2 where Motel 6 has admitted that information was released, they've given us no information in terms of numbers or any other information at all. Motel 6, now turning to the other motels there, besides those 6, Motel 6 told us that the other 5 corporate-owned locations did not disclose guest information to ICE. We will, of course, confirm whether or not that is true as part of this litigation. The remaining 15 Washington locations are franchises. Motel 6 has not provided us any information on whether they voluntarily disclosed guest information or not. We don't know. So we're going to talk to you about the information we currently have from the handful of Motel 6s in Washington State. And I want to be clear that we will continue to investigate whether this conduct was occurring at the other 5 corporate-owned locations in Washington and the 15 Motel 6 franchises in Washington State. In other words, we're going to find out for those other 20 motels were involved as well. Consequently, the 9,151 number of guests having their information handed over to the federal government without their knowledge or consent is just a starting point, and we expect that number to grow significantly as we get more information. Now, the specifics may vary among the 6 locations, but I want to give you an example and describe to you how this worked, how this practice worked at one Washington location, and that location I'll be speaking about now specifically is South Everett. So ICE would usually arrive at Motel 6 early in the morning or late at night. The agents requested that day's guest list from the motel. The Motel 6 employee provided that guest list and a form called the Law Enforcement Acknowledgement Form. That's a form that's created by Motel 6. The form has signature lines for the ICE agent and the Motel 6 employee to sign when handing over guest information to ICE. This form was virtually identical across the 4 locations from which we received information. Again, those 4 locations are Everett North, Everett South, Seattle, and Tacoma South. In May of 2017, we know that the form was updated at multiple locations at almost the same time. Notably, nothing on the form asks whether a warrant is involved. According to Motel 6 staff, the ICE agents circled any Latino or Latina sounding names on the guest registry and returned to their vehicles, presumably to run those names through a database. Motel 6 admits that ICE detained at least 6 individuals as a result of this practice on or near Motel 6 property. Everett North had 5 individuals detained, and Everett South had 1. The South Everett location alone provided ICE confidential information, on average, more than once per day between February 1st to September 14th of this year. I believe we have a chart on that as well, as you'll see. So South Everett location specifically, they alone provided information on average more than once a day. At that location, Motel 6 provided ICE lists of hotel guests 228 times in a 225-day period. They released the names and private information of at least 1,539 guests to ICE during that time period. Again, this number does not represent the full extent of the privacy violations, as the information provided by Motel 6 regarding the South Everett location was not complete for the full period that we requested information. Motel 6 trained their new employees in this practice. They trained them to release guests' private information to ICE. So we're talking about thousands of Washingtonians, individuals in Washington State, who had their information released to ICE without their knowledge or consent. Motel 6's actions are disturbing and they are unlawful. The Consumer Protection Act prohibits unfair or deceptive business practices. Those are the words actually in the law. You cannot engage in an unfair or deceptive business practice. Motel 6's actions were both unfair and they were deceptive. Motel 6 violated our state's Consumer Protection Act thousands of times in multiple ways. I'll speak at a high level about our legal claims. First, Motel 6 committed unfair business practices in violation of our Consumer Protection Act by violating the privacy of thousands of guests. Our state constitution provides protections to keep our personal information private. We take privacy so seriously in Washington state that in 1889, when the individuals who wrote our Constitution got together to put that together, they granted additional privacy protections beyond the federal Constitution. In our state Constitution, we granted additional protections for privacy. Motel 6 told the federal government where thousands of people were sleeping in any particular night. They shared everyone's information, all of their guests. So if you were staying at one of these Motel 6s during this relevant time period, your information was likely given to ICE. I think it's fair to say we all instinctively feel that where we sleep at night is private. And it should come as no surprise that the Washington State Supreme Court said exactly that about a decade ago. The state Supreme Court has ruled that guest registry information is private information. Our Supreme Court was very clear on this point. When law enforcement conducts random searches of hotel registry information, it violates rights to privacy found in our Constitution. In fact, the court even gave examples of the many lawful reasons you might want to keep your hotel stay private. Quoting from the Supreme Court, business people engaged in confidential negotiations. Also quoting, one could also imagine a scenario where a domestic violence victim flees to a hotel in hopes of remaining hidden from an abuser. Do you want law enforcement to know what you are doing, who are you with, the room you're staying in, without any legal justification? That is exactly what was going on here. The second way Motel 6 violated the Consumer Protection Act is they engage in a deceptive practice by violating their own privacy policy and misrepresenting its privacy policy to guests and prospective guests. Motel 6's privacy policy states that it is, quote, committed to safeguarding the privacy of the personal information of their guests. That is not true. In its privacy policy, the hotel goes on to assure guests that from time to time we may disclose your personal information. We will always endeavor to make that disclosure in accordance with applicable law. They did not do that here. I also want to point out that this is contrary to industry standard. When I was reading those news articles down in Arizona, there was a quote from a spokesperson for the American Hotel and Lodging Association. That's the largest U.S. hotel trade group. And in response to this news coming out, they were quoted saying, "We understand that the standard practice is that guest information of any type is not turned over to anybody asking for it absent a subpoena, except under extenuating circumstances." The examples they gave was someone's life may be in danger. So I want to be clear on this. When they handed over a guest list, it wasn't just the folks that ICE was interested in, it was everybody staying at the hotel. And we allege that each time they release a guest confidential information, that is a separate violation of the Consumer Protection Act. Third way that Motel 6 violated the Consumer Protection Act, as you know, we have a state law against discrimination, the Washington State Law Against Discrimination. Sometimes you'll hear us refer to it as the WALAD. And that protects Washingtonians from discrimination based on, for example, race or religion or gender. A violation of the WALAD, the Washington State Law Against Discrimination, in the course of trade or commerce, like a hotel, is an automatic violation of the Consumer Protection Act. So if you run a business and you violate our state law against discrimination, that's an automatic violation of the Consumer Protection Act. The Washington State Law Against Discrimination also protects Washingtonians from discrimination based on their national origin, both directly and indirectly, and we assert that Motel 6's actions were both directly and indirectly discriminatory in a place of public accommodation. Motel 6 is, of course, a business that is open to the public, which means that it cannot discriminate against its customers. The company knew that ICE asked for guest registry information with the intent to target people based on their national origin. That's what ICE was doing there. By voluntarily assisting ICE in its efforts to target people based on their national origin, Motel 6 discriminated against their guests who were paying to stay at their hotel. A business cannot excuse itself from blame when it knows that its actions will lead to certain groups being targeted. We'll give you an example. If a nightclub owner hires private security, it knows keeps minorities out of its clubs, that's discrimination. Motel 6 knew the results of its actions, discrimination. Just a few final thoughts and I'll turn it over to Jorge. The reporter in Arizona, as I mentioned, uncovered this was going on in 2 locations in Arizona. The company said that this practice was implemented at the local level without the knowledge of senior management. With their public statement, Motel 6 clearly wanted to give the impression that this was an isolated incident limited to 2 motels in the Phoenix area. We contacted Motel 6 at the end of September, right after this news broke, with our investigation. Months later, they knew, as a result of our investigation, what was going on in Washington State. Despite that, it's now been months, Motel 6 has not corrected their public statement from September. We have now discovered that their statements back in September are not true. It was not isolated to 2 hotels in Phoenix, not by a long shot. The company's actions were methodical. They trained their new employees on how to do this. The locations had a similar form. The form changed in basically the same time. They provide information about all of their guests every single day. Motel 6 has admitted that 6 locations turned over private personal information of thousands of guests to the federal government without their guests' knowledge or consent. My goals for this litigation are straightforward. First, Motel 6 will be held accountable for their outrageous conduct. Second, we will obtain complete information regarding the 6 Motel 6s that released personal information. Third, we will determine whether the other 20 locations in Washington State also released personal information and private information of their guests. Fourth, we are going to find out who at Motel 6 knew what and when they knew it. So with that background on the case that we filed today, I'm going to turn over to Jorge Barone. As I mentioned, he's the Executive Director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, a lawyer and a tremendous advocate for a lot of people in our state. Jorge?
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I wanted to be here, and I'm pleased that Attorney General Ferguson has taken this action today, and I want to commend him and his entire team, and particularly the folks at the Civil Rights Unit for taking this action, discovering and challenging this disturbing, unlawful pattern of behavior by a national company. We're deeply troubled by the actions of this national change for a number of reasons. First of all, it's clear the information that the Attorney General's office has uncovered so far clearly reveals a pattern of discriminatory conduct by the company and its employees. It is evident that people who were perceived to be Latino were the focus of this conduct without any evidence that they had violated any law at the time. Second, while law enforcement agencies have an important role to play, they have to follow the law. And they should not be taking advantage of violations of the law by private actors, which is what we have here. Third, this kind of practice is having an impact in our communities that is really hard to quantify. We should, of course, all be concerned about the fact that this practice is violating the privacy rights of thousands of residents of our state, but we should also be concerned about the fact that this practice is almost certainly leading to people being targeted unfairly. And I just want to point out that, the fact that they're using just names for this kind of conduct is going to lead to enforcement to people who weren't originally targeted by ICE, to people who might have been just in the room or in the car vehicle traveling with other people. And so this is going to lead, I'm sure it's leading to a dragnet, and we have more information to uncover. Now, I know one question that people might have is why this kind of conduct is so hard to identify. And why this wasn't uncovered earlier, because obviously it's been happening for a long time. And I think it's just important to remember that people who are detained by ICE aren't provided appointed attorneys when they're detained and placed in deportation hearings. So that leads to a lot of things not being uncovered because they don't have the right to vindicate their legal rights and discriminatory conduct. So it is particularly important that the Attorney General's office has taken this action to uncover this practice, and I commend them for that. And as Attorney General Ferguson pointed out, There's still a lot to learn about this case. There's still a lot of information that we need to know, and so I commend them for their work, and I urge them to continue in finding the information that we need to make sure we identify the full impact of this unlawful and discriminatory conduct. Thank you.
Thanks, Jorge. And for now, we'll turn to questions. For those on the phone, we'll start with questions here in the room. We'll then turn to some folks. I think there are some folks on the phone, so we'll try to take some calls on the phone. We'll do our best for those on the call to repeat the questions here, so you can hear it. If I forget to do that, someone feel free to poke me and remind me. Yes, go right ahead.
So, how long ago was the report to find out about what was happening in Arizona? Do you know if this was happening in any other states? Is somebody looking into that?
So I think it was a 2 or 3 part question. I think the first, let me take them in reverse order. One question was, is anyone looking at this in other states? I think was one of the questions. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not aware. I've done a fair amount of reading about this issue. I'm not aware of any other states that have announced any sort of investigation. I don't want to suggest there's not a private investigation going on, but I'm fairly confident nothing public has come out about any additional investigation going on in any other state. Then I think your first question was, when did this first come out in Arizona? And the article came out in a Phoenix newspaper, and I want to say around September 14th or so, just a few months ago, in other words, September 14th of 2017, and that was immediately picked up by national news outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, you name it. It got a lot of coverage at that time in mid-September of 2017. Yeah.
Do you know if any of the detentions have led to deportations or deportation proceedings?
So the question is, do we know if any of the individuals who are detained have been deported? And the answer is we do not know. Is that correct? We do. I'm just confirming with Mitch and Colleen, but the answer is we do not know what has happened to those individuals. And I think I mentioned that there were at least 6 individuals that Motel 6 has admitted to us that were detained as a result of their practice. I want to emphasize, though, that we expect that number to be higher. That we have to say incomplete information, is possibly even an understatement. So we expect that number to grow as things go forward. Yeah.
What kind of restitution or penalties are you seeking, since you're saying every
Yes.
violation, every time they saw a registered name, that was a violation under state law? What are you asking for?
So the question is, essentially, what are we asking for in terms of penalties, restitution, whatever that might be? Well, as you often know, at the very early stage when we file a complaint, things become more clear as a lawsuit goes forward. We'll get more information, so I don't want to predetermine that. But I think it's fair to say that under our Consumer Protection Act, every individual violation of the Consumer Protection Act, a judge can impose a penalty of up to $2,000 per individual violation of the Consumer Protection Act. We believe that every name that was handed over to ICE, that name represents a violation of the Consumer Protection Act. As you know, we're saying more than 9,000 that we're aware of now were turned over. So it's obviously many, many thousands of violations of the Consumer Protection Act that we believe occurred here. And we'll see as we go forward in terms of how this case is handled, in terms of restitution, penalties, what we'll be asking for. But this early stage, I think it's fair to say that we are alleging many thousands of violations of the Consumer Protection Act, and we'll see how things go forward on that. And Natalie?
AG Ferguson, did ICE indicate why they were looking for this information? Do we know anything about motivation? And if it goes back 2 years, it was happening under 2 presidential administrations. So was it an administration directive or an ICE issue? What have you learned about motivation?
So the question is motivation regarding ICE. We don't know what their motivations are on this. I mean, you have to call up ICE and see if they'll share anything with you. I don't want to answer for them. I also don't know what the motivation is for Motel 6, quite candidly. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why on earth would they have a policy like this and engage in it so methodically. Turning over the names of your own guests, in some cases leading to people being detained. For the life of me, I can't understand what would possess Motel 6. So you'd have to ask Motel 6 their motivations, and you'd have to ask ICE their motivations in terms of how they go about doing their respective business.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
You had mentioned there was training involved.
Mhm.
Can you describe or elaborate Motel 6 was training their employees?
Sure. I may turn to Colleen or Mitch maybe to elaborate, but I'll repeat the question so folks can hear it. The question goes to, can we elaborate at all on the training that was done by Motel 6 with their employees? Can we elaborate on that? So one of you guys want to take that one? Sure. Just introduce yourself, Mitch, for the folks on the phone.
I am Mitch Reese. The information we've got is that Motel 6 would, when they hired new employees, would simply tell them, show them how the forms need to be provided to ICE when they came to the facility, along with the guest list. There was no warrant that was required. Nothing else other than ICE's simple request for the guest list for that day. And that's what the receptionists and employees who provided the guest lists were trained to do.
Someone over here had a question?
That was
Oh, that was it. Okay, great.
that. But as far as going beyond just this hotel chain and others, is there any evidence or concerns about moving forward for folks who don't want to use hotels in these situations? I think it goes beyond just this chain.
I'm sorry, repeat that one. I just want to make sure I get that right. Yeah, do you mind repeating that one more time?
Other concerns beyond Motel 6?
Oh, with other hotels? Oh, I see. The question is, do we have concerns with other hotels engaging in presumably in a similar practice beyond Motel 6? Well, I guess I want to be thoughtful in how I answer that.
Or is that something you're investigating?
No, as you know, we don't talk about our investigations. We don't make those public until we have something to announce publicly. We file something. I guess what I'd say is the following is, first, I am intensely interested and very focused on getting the full story from Motel 6. And that's going to happen. They're going to turn that information over, and you will all know what they have to say about it. That's going to happen. There's no resolution of this case without that happening. Number two, I'm going to speak a bit more broadly. Anytime in the civil rights area or consumer protection area that we see something going on that we think is especially egregious, I think it's fair to say we're curious, hey, is this isolated to a particular business or is something more going on? I don't have the answer for you on that. But I think it's fair to say I'm interested in that, especially as we have discovered that we're talking about at least 6 locations at Motel 6s here in Washington with so many thousands of individuals impacted, and the consequences for those individuals. My God, right? You're being detained as a result of that. So I think given the extent at Motel 6 and the consequences involved, the adverse consequences involved, I'll be talking to the team about, hey, how do we proceed with this, and if it's appropriate in some way to see if there's something more going on besides Motel 6. Let's go to, I don't think Essex has a chance yet. Go ahead, Essex.
The federal government has broad constitutional authority to enforce immigration law. Why should Motel 6 or any other business be in trouble for assisting them in enforcing immigration?
Sure. So the question goes to that ICE has broad authority to enforce immigration laws, which they do. Why should a hotel, for example, like Motel 6, be in trouble with the law for turning over information? Well, a couple thoughts on that. So number one, our state Supreme Court has made it clear that that information is private. Number two, as I mentioned in my remarks, Motel 6 had a policy that was on their website saying, we will protect your information. We'll only turn it over, we'll endeavor to follow the law before we turn anything over. Neither of those statements are true. That's deceptive and unfair conduct. So, yes, does ICE have broad authority to enforce our federal immigration laws? You bet. But that does not absolve businesses in our state from following our state Consumer Protection Act and our state law against discrimination. We think from our standpoint that the law is clear on this. You cannot engage in deceptive or unfair business practices. You cannot tell your guests, here's our policy with your private information, say one thing and do something else. That's deceptive. We also think it's unfair.
And another question on immigration as well. The acting head of immigration enforcement has just said that he believes local officials that assist sanctuary cities should be arrested for violating federal law and assisting in having a sanctuary city and conducting that. Are you concerned that you might be arrested for assisting a sanctuary state, or that local officials could be arrested, say the mayor of Seattle, because this is a sanctuary city?
So just to make sure I understood that, Essex. So I do my best to anticipate every question, as the team knows. So we have a session before, and this one I did not anticipate. Sorry, so somebody said, just make sure I heard that right.
This was the acting head of immigration enforcement.
The acting head of immigration enforcement, speaking yesterday, said that it was...
Said that local officials who engage in sanctuary practices
Got it.
should be arrested for doing so.
The local officials engaging, I'm just repeating for the folks on the phone, local officials engaging in supporting sanctuary jurisdictions, those local officials should be arrested. Well, I'm confident Essex, if they come from my legal team, is a strong one. I'm going to be okay. I don't look. It's nothing's going to stop me from doing my job and protecting the rights of Washingtonians. Period. Full stop. I'm not the least bit interested in what whoever that person was had to say. They're no threat to me. I'm more worried about the threat to Washingtonians, their privacy, and individuals being detained because businesses in our state don't follow the rules. That's what I'm focused on, and that's all I'm focused on.
Should local mayors, for example, be concerned?
My suspicion is Jenny Durk and other local mayors can take care of themselves and will comment for themselves. Yeah.
How high up, in your investigation at this point, as far as you can speak to it, how high up in the chain of command at Motel 6 did this go? How high up did they know about it? How high up was it authorized?
So I'll repeat the question. I'm not sure it's one we can answer. I'll turn to Colleen and Mitch as well. But it's a question I've been asking as well, which is how high up did it go within Motel 6 in terms of knowledge? I guess, do you guys want to, is there anything we can, Colleen, do you want, I'll turn to Colleen or Mitch to answer that as best we can.
Sure.
Mitch, do you want to? Yep.
The short answer is that we don't know, although there's some of the information that we've received indicates that it occurred at more than a local level. So, for example, these law enforcement acknowledgement forms that the ICE agents and the Motel 6 employee had to sign when they provided the guest list, it appears that they were, corporate forms. The forms were changed within a couple of weeks of each other across different locations. So we need to obtain further information, but that's what we know at this point.
Yeah, one more, then we'll go to folks on the phone. Go right ahead.
Just to narrow it down,
Mhm.
what I'm thinking is that this is primarily a case where someone had a privacy policy and it was violated. Therefore it's violating Washington state law in that. I'm broadening out the question because couldn't this apply to all other types of businesses? If ICE comes in and asks for information and the privacy policy of that company says we will not divulge that information, isn't that what the case is all about here?
The question goes to what the implications might mean more broadly than for Motel 6
Yeah.
And businesses' privacy policies. I think what I would say is that, hey, all businesses should ensure that whatever their privacy policies are, whether it's turning over guest lists or protecting data, whatever it might be, make sure what you say publicly to your customers is consistent with your practice. That's your job. That's pretty straightforward. You've got to be consistent with that. And that most definitely did not happen here. So I'm going to turn to see if anyone on the phone has a quick question or two, and I'll repeat those for the folks in the room.
Yeah, this is Terry Cornfield from the Everett Herald. Two quick questions. First, on the 6 people who were detained, can you tell us the time period of when they were detained? And second, the lawsuit talks about a permanent injunction against Motel 6. Are you trying to enjoin them from providing information anymore to the ICE?
So it was a two-part question. I'll let the team answer at least, or maybe in both parts. So one part was that in our complaint, we're seeking injunction, and are we asking the court to ensure that Motel 6 does not turn over guest information to ICE? And the first question, if I recall, was for the individuals who were detained, what time period, I think the question was, did that happen? So I'll turn to Mitch or Colleen for that.
Sure.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Okay. We are asking for injunctive relief to prohibit Motel 6 from providing these guest lists in the future in violation of Washington law. On the individuals that we know were detained by ICE, that occurred over a period of several months. I think most of them were in 2017. I don't have the exact dates at my fingertips, but most of them were over about a 6-month period in 2017.
And I think somebody else on the phone was trying to ask a question as well.
That was me. This is Fondley with the Associated Press. In Phoenix, when this came about, Motel 6 said that they would stop working with ICE, and that was roughly September 14th. Were there instances where they provided lists after that time here in Washington State? I think you had mentioned September 22nd, but I'm just trying to see if they kept doing it after saying they wouldn't in Phoenix. Thanks.
So I think everybody heard the question, which was, hey, did this, at the time this came out in mid-September, Motel 6 you are correct, put out an announcement saying that they were going to discontinue this practice nationwide. And I think the question is, do we have any evidence that the practice continued in Washington State after that date? Mitch, do you want to, I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure we get that exactly right. Mitch will answer that.
Yeah, we do not have any information that indicates that Motel 6 continued to disclose the guest lists after mid-September of 2017.
And we asked for information through September 22nd, is that right?
Yes.
And just to be clear on that, so I think that we don't have information they did, but the information we requested, I think I said at the beginning the dates, the time period we're looking, where we asked for, and it went through, correct me if I'm wrong, Mitch, January 1st, 2015 through September 22nd, 2017. So that was the time, just to be really clear to everybody, that was the time period when we sent our request to Motel 6 for documents. That was the time period that we asked for. So the time period only went through September 22nd, 2017, which was, to your question, right when the story essentially had broken. So we just don't know after September 22nd. We do not have information that it was continuing after that date. And let's do one more on the phone if folks have it, then I'll try and take another one here, and we'll be around afterwards, take one-on-one questions as well. Anyone else on the phone have a question? If not, we'll do a couple more here in the room. Yeah, go right ahead.
Oh, just regarding ICE itself, is ICE in any way culpable here in terms of your filing? Do they have any responsibility with regard to the privacy of the guests at Motel 6?
So the question is about ICE. Is there anything that we're asserting against ICE? It's not in this complaint. No, we're not. Colleen or Mitch, do you want to speak to any aspect of this that concerns ICE practices? Colleen?
So the complaint doesn't challenge ICE conduct. It doesn't name ICE as a defendant. But earlier, one of the questions was about what is Motel 6's responsibility when ICE comes to the door. And ICE has warrant options available to it. It can seek a warrant, and it knows how to do that. And so, you know, if Motel 6 wants to comply with the law, it should require ICE to bring a warrant when it seeks guest information. And that's the way this process is supposed to work. And that's what the Washington Supreme Court has told us are Motel 6's obligations as the holder of its private guest information.
A quick follow-up, please, if you don't mind. Is there a message that you would impart to ICE based on the experience that you're now investigating and the actions you're taking?
I mean, I think that the message is for Motel 6 today, that it knew what its responsibilities were. It has an obligation to file Washington law when it does business here in our state, and it did not do that.
Do you want to just oh, yeah, go ahead, Colleen, give your name and title. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Colleen Melody, and I'm the chief of the Wing Luke Civil Rights Unit.
And Mitch, you mind giving your spelling of your last name as well, just as long as we're getting all the spellings cleared away?
Okay.
Mitch, yeah.
It's Mitchell Reese, Riese.
Okay. And let's do one more question here, if anyone has one here before we wrap up. Going once.
Actually,
Go, Essex, yeah.
For Ms.
Mhm,
Melody.
yeah.
If ICE were to seek a warrant, could they get a warrant for the entire guest list?
Can you repeat the question and then, yeah.
The question is, if ICE were to seek a warrant, could it get a warrant for the entire guest list? And the answer to that is it would depend on both federal Fourth Amendment law as it applies to ICE in that context. And so I think that they would have to make a showing to get a warrant. It's an individualized process, and so I suppose it depends on what kind of a showing they make, but it would be fact specific. It would be depending on the circumstance.
And so, thanks everyone for being on the phone and being here in person. We really appreciate it. Special thanks to Jorge for his fantastic work. We want to encourage individuals who feel they were negatively impacted or impacted at all by this practice to contact our office. They could also contact Jorge's office at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, but we encourage folks, as always, to reach out and let us know if they've had an experience through this practice. Look, just to wrap up, I spent a lot of time contemplating what possibly could have possessed Motel 6 to have a policy like this. I do not have an answer to that question, but I intend to find out. The scale of what Motel 6 was doing is deeply disturbing to me as an individual, as a Washingtonian, and as the Attorney General of this state. My message for Motel 6 is I am taking this case very, very seriously. They should get their documents to us right away. They will be held accountable. And to some of your questions, I was not impressed by Motel 6's response to this in Arizona at all. They had weeks to think about what they would say before this story broke. And their two-sentence statement was utterly lacking and did not even have an apology. They've tried to portray this as a local issue. Hey, a couple motels in Arizona, local thing, senior management didn't know. We know at least much of that was not true. And it's my hope that this raises awareness of this issue around the country as well. I think others asked, hey, are there other investigations going on? Well, we don't know that. I hope that other law enforcement folks take a look at this issue and give some thought to whether they should ask Motel 6 questions as well. Lastly, this is why we have a consumer protection team and a civil rights team. If you're a guest at Motel 6, if any of you stayed at Motel 6 during the relevant time period at those locations, your information was likely turned over to ICE. Or if a loved one stayed there, it's turned over to ICE. How do you feel about that? I know how I feel about that. And the reason we have a consumer protection team is folks wouldn't even know their information was turned over. How would you know? You have no reason to think that's going on. And that's why we have a team that can investigate and get to the bottom of what's going on. So I'm really proud of the team. They're working the last 3 months to uncover much of this information. We'll let you know when we have more information and keep you updated as this case proceeds. Thanks so much, everybody. Happy New Year.